Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 4 of the CIA videos for this book. In this video we're going to be covering local enumeration both on Windows targets and on Linux targets. So the objective here is to take you through the process of enumerating as much information as possible from the target system, whether it be a Windows system or a Linux system. Now, of course, we're not going to cover everything that we actually covered within this chapter. We're going to be focusing primarily on the important aspects of performing local enumeration. So the first thing that I want to point out is most of the techniques that we highlighted in the chapter again are going to be Windows commands for the Windows operating system firstly, and of course what that means is if you have a meterpreter session on the target, or you gained access and were able to get a meterpreter session, you will need to get a shell session on the target system. Now this can easily be done by typing in the shell command if you are on a meterpreter session. Now if you don't have access through a meterpreter session, then you don't need to do anything else. So if I hit shell, that will again give me a Windows prompt on the target system. So I'm currently on the Windows 7 target system. That is the system that I've exploited, and that is the one that we're actually going to be using for this particular demonstration, right? So we're going to start off on the Windows target, and we're going to start off by performing system enumeration. So by default, if we wanted to display, the operating system information or the actual system information on the target on Windows, what we would do is we would type in system info, right? So we'd hit enter, and that is going to enumerate a lot of information, right? And the important information that it's going to reveal are going to be the operating system name, the operating system version, the build type, as well as the hotfixes that are currently installed, which you can see right here. Now you can also limit the results by piping out the actual output of this command. So if I type in system info, I can then pipe that into the find string utility, which will help us find particular strings. And we will then limit that to the let me just limit that to the operating system name. So we'll limit the results to the operating system name, as well as let's see, we also want to limit the results to the operating system version. So this particular command will actually limit the results to the operating system name and the operating system version. So if I hit enter, you can see it gives us the operating system name. Now for some reason it did not display the operating system version there, and that is because of the incorrect spelling here. So again, if I just copy that there, and let me just paste that one more time, and let me just correct the actual spelling here. So operating system version, hit enter, and that'll display both the operating system name and operating system version. So you can use the find string utility to limit the results, to limit the results of a particular command to the information that you are interested in particularly. All right, so now that we have an idea of what the system is running, we can also run a few other commands to determine what other hotfixes and patches have been installed on the system. So by default, you can see the system info command lists out the hotfixes that have been installed. The hotfixes are a vital piece of information on Windows that tell you whether a system has been patched, or you can actually use the hotfix information to determine what exploits or privilege escalation techniques you can perform. Now this is going to be especially useful when performing kernel exploitation, but as I said, we can also use the WMIC utility to actually determine what hotfixes and patches have been installed. This can be done by typing in WMIC and we then type in QFE, right? And we hit enter, and it'll again show you the hotfixes or the updates that were installed and their hotfix IDs. So you can actually track patches through the hotfix IDs on the Microsoft website. And it actually gives you the actual reference link right over here to track that particular hotfix or that particular update. It also tells you who the update or hotfix was installed by. In this case, we can see that the update KB 976.902 was installed by the administrator, and it gives you the date there. So that's quite useful information, because hotfix IDs can be used to determine potential vulnerabilities and exploit for these specific hotfixes for the operating system. All right. Now, if you want to determine the host name of the target, we can simply type in host name like so. And again, it tells us the host name of this particular target is Windows 7 PC, which is, fairly simple. But we don't need to, get much more information than that. Now, of course, we can also list out the services that are currently running on the target by typing in task list, and we can then say SVC services. There we are, and that'll list out the list of services running on the target. And of course, you can go through them. It also lists out the process IDs, which can also be helpful, but again, it gives you a basic idea of what's running on the target. So for example, we are able to identify an interesting service here, the VirtualBox service, which pretty much tells us as an attacker that this particular operating system is being virtualized. And of course, that's just a simple example here. Right, so that is how to enumerate the tasks. Now, if I want to determine the current user that I'm logged in as, or the current user that we have access to, I can simply type in who am I, and it tells me that I'm currently the user. This is the user here, so the user is simply called user. And again, if I want to list out the privileges that I have with this current user, I can type in who am I and /priv, and I hit enter, and it gives me the list of privileges that I have. So for example, I have the ability to shut down the system. I have the ability to, change the time zone, but nothing else. So I'm pretty much an unprivileged user on the system, which again is the objective of this book, is to take you from this user to the administrator user, or to give you additional privileges so that you can increase your domain of control on the target system. Right, so we can also list out the groups on the system. So, on Windows, you usually have groups, and we can also list those out by typing in who am I groups. And over here, you can see that we have the NT Authority interactive group. We also have the NT Authority NTLM authentication group for NTLM authentication, and then authenticated users and this organization. So now that we have an understanding of the groups that are currently on the system, we can also enumerate the users that are currently on the system, because we want to determine what user we can actually try and exploit, or the user that we want to try and impersonate. For example, if we're performing an impersonation attack. So if I type in net user, you can see that the current users we have are administrator, Windows 7, guest, and the current user that we're logged in as. So ideally, we would like to get the privileges of the administrator user, right? So that is fairly simple. Now, we can also determine the users that are part of the administrator group. So if we wanted to, identify, any users who are part of the administrator group, we could do that. And of course, that's not really important in this case, because we were able to identify the administrator user just straight out of the box, and we weren't able to determine any other useful or potentially useful users here, as the system is fairly simple. So now let's talk about network enumeration, right? So we want to try and enumerate as much information regarding the networking aspect of the operating system. So the first thing we can do is type in ipconfig, and we'll list out all the information, and this will give us a list of all adapters or interfaces, and the IP information, and as well as the gateway, the default gateway, DHCP server, so on and so forth. So you can see in this case, for the Ethernet connection, the physical address is provided here. That's the MAC address. The IPv4 address is provided here, as well as the default gateway. So as an attacker, this information will give you an idea as to the network infrastructure and subnet being used on the network. So again, just from this information only, I can identify the default gateway, and I can then stage an attack on that particular on the particular gateway. It may be a switch, it may be a router, so on and so forth. So that's great. We also get the DHCP server IP address, which can again be very, very useful if you're trying to perform various DHCP attacks. But of course, we're not taking a look at that right now. Now, if you wanted to also analyze the routing table on the operating system or on the target, you can simply type in route print, and this will print out the routing table. which again gives you an idea of how the network, of how the operating system is handling the routing, or essentially is used to give you the destination address, the network destination address, the net mask, and the gateway, as well as the interface. So again, it gives you a basic idea of how your network handles routing. Right, in this case, we can see it's fairly simple. The default gateway is given right over here. Right, okay, so that is the gateway information. We can also list out the services that are currently running and what ports they're currently running on. So if we wanted to list out all the listening or active connections, we can use the netstat command and say netstat ANO, and that will list out a list of services that are currently listening and their respective ports, as well as the process IDs. So for example, we can see it sorts it out into the protocol, the local address, the foreign address, that's the actual connection address, the state, and the process ID. So right over here, you can see that we have the standard Windows services. We have port 135, port 445 for SMB. We can also see the Meterpreter session that I'm currently connected as, or the actual Meterpreter connection, and you can see that it connects to the foreign address, which is the Cali IP on port 1234. And we also get the actual respective process ID. So that can be very useful information, right? You also get your UDP protocols or your UDP connections, which again can be quite useful. So that information can be useful if you're trying to identify what services are currently running. All right, so now that we've actually been able to perform local enumeration, and we've been able to gather quite a bit of information, let's try and begin performing some advanced enumeration on the target system. So one of the things we'll need to do is try and identify whether we have Windows Defender enabled and running on the target system. So Windows Defender is the antivirus solution that's installed on Windows operating systems by default. And again, it can be used. This information can be very useful to determine what type of attacks or privilege escalation attacks you can launch or stage on the target, and whether or not they'll be detected. It'll also allow you to encode your payloads in the event you have an antivirus solution running on the target. So I can say sc query, and I can say win defend, like so, and that'll tell me whether Windows Defender is currently running. And in this case, you can see that Windows Defender is currently stopped. That means it's not running, which pretty much tells us that I can send over payloads and they'll not be detected, and I don't need to perform any encoding. That, however, doesn't mean that we don't need to perform any obfuscation or encoding, because there may be other intrusion detection systems on the network, or the target system may have another antivirus solution installed, right? Now, in order to identify third-party antivirus solutions, we can list out the services again that are running on the system. So, I can say sc query query x, and we then take type is equal to service, right? And we hit enter, and looks like that is an error there. So let me just terminate that. Sorry. Let me just spawn a new shell session. There we are, and we'll run that command one more time. So we'll say sc query, and we then type service, right? And we hit enter, and that looks like it's not displaying the correct information here, which is interesting. But if we try and list out the services, let's actually try and list that out again. So sc query, and we then say query. Yeah, I actually made a spelling mistake there. So service, we hit enter, type sc query x, type is service, and that is not listing. That is not actually. It actually tells us that the enumeration query service status failed. Okay, so that's fine. We can also, display or enumerate the information regarding the firewall status. So again, we can say net sh, and then we, display the status of the Windows firewall. So we want to, check and see whether it's currently enabled and active. In our case, you can see that the profile is set to standard, the operation mode is set to enable, exception mode is set to enable, so on and so forth. So what this means is that Windows Firewall is currently active and enabled, which means if we are trying to connect or perform any form of attacks that will involve connecting to a reverse shell, we have to be cognizant of the fact that some of the connections, the outbound or even incoming connections to the target, may be blocked. So again, as a penetration tester, that gives you a good idea of what you're dealing with here. All right, so that is pretty much all that I wanted to cover in regards to the manual, the manual aspects of local enumeration. Of course, in this particular chapter, we covered, how to use automated enumeration tools. Of course, that process is fairly simple, and we're going to be avoiding that in this video because we wanted to focus on the process of performing a local enumeration manually. So that is how to perform local enumeration manually on Windows targets. Now let's also take a look at how to do this on a Linux target. Alright, so I've gained access to the Linux target, which in this case is going to be Metasploitable 2. And we can begin the enumeration process by starting off similar to Windows with system enumeration. So the first thing you want to do on a Linux box is, of course, identify the current user that you're logged in as. So, I can say who am I instead of get user ID, because we're not running in a interpreter session, but who am I will display the current user you're logged in as. And in our case, we're logged in as the MSF admin user. The next thing we want to do is try and enumerate the actual distribution that this is actually running. So to do that, we type in cat etc release, and in this case, you can see the distribution ID is set to Ubuntu. The distribution release is version 8.04, so this information can be useful in identifying potential kernel exploits that can be used to elevate your privileges on the target system. So now that we have an understanding of the version of Ubuntu that's running, we also want to identify the kernel that's actually running. So if we type in uname r, that'll display the actual Linux kernel that's running on the target. In this case, the Linux kernel is 2.6.24.16, and it's a server kernel. So again, that gives us quite a bit of information as in regards to what we have there or what we have running on the target. Right, so if you wanted to display or determine the architecture of the operating system being used, we can type in uname a, and in this case it gives us the host name, the Linux kernel, and it tells us the actual architecture here, which in this case is i686, which means this is a 32-bit version of Ubuntu, which again can be useful when creating payloads, in order to understand the architecture. In order to stage a successful attack, you need to set up or generate payloads that are compatible in terms of the architecture of the operating system and what code can be executed. We can also list out the services that are currently running on the target. So to do this, we can use the PS and we will say AUX, and that'll list out all the services that are currently running on the target. Now it's going to sort it out into the user, the owner of that service, the process ID, the CPU and memory consumption, as well as the command that is actually being run, or rather the service. Now you can see that in the case of privilege escalation, we pretty much want to identify services that are being run by the root user. So again, the reason we want to limit our results to the processes that are actually being run as the root user is because if we can exploit the particular service that's running, we can get our arbitrary commands to be executed as root, and therefore provide us with elevated privileges if we are going to execute a reverse shell code, for example. So in this case, what we can do, again, we can simply pipe out the results, and we can then say grep. We can use the grep utility to limit the results to the user root. And in this case, it only lists out the services that are running as the user root. And of course, we can analyze this information to determine whether we have any vulnerable services here that can be hijacked or that can execute arbitrary code as the root user and provide us with an elevated session. So this is quite important. Now, another important piece of information is to list out or to try and determine what programs or software has been installed on the target. Now, this can be done by listing out the contents of the following directories. Number one, it's going to be the user local directory. So if I type in user local, you can see it's going to list out the actual directories within the user local directory. And of course, if we wanted to determine or identify any binaries, we can access the bin or binary directory. So if we list out the contents of the binary directory, this will not give us anything there. Now we can also check out the shared directory. So if we say lsal user local share, and we list out the contents there, that'll list out the all the shared binaries or pieces of software or resources that are available there. And in this case, we have the fonts, what appears to be the man pages, and a few other utilities. Now we can also list out any third-party programs or scripts that are being used by listing out the contents of the OPT directory. In this case, we don't find anything there. And yeah, you can essentially list out or try and identify any programs, binaries, or services that are currently available that may have been configured correctly, so on and so forth. And of course, we'll be touching upon this later on in this book. You can also list the install packages on Debian systems by running the dpkg command. Now, we are currently on a Debian system because it's an Ubuntu distribution. So Ubuntu is based on Debian. So we can say dpkg, and that's the Debian package management utility, and we can list out the installed packages like so. Now the reason we're doing this is primarily because some of these packages and more specifically the versions of these packages may be vulnerable to certain exploits that again can in some cases provide us with an elevated session. So again, there's going to be tons of packages here, and it's going to give you the respective versions and a bit of a description as to what this package does. So we can again try and identify vulnerabilities within any of these packages and vulnerabilities that can be exploited more specifically to provide us with an elevated session on the target system. So for example, I can search for vulnerabilities for Apache 2 version 2.2.8, right? And I can then start performing some vulnerability analysis on that particular version, trying to identify whether that is vulnerable. Right, so if you are on a Fedora or Red Hat distribution, then you can use the rpm command to list out the installed packages. Now in terms of cron, I'm not really going to be covering cron enumeration because we will have a chapter focused on this topic, solely on this topic. So we'll cover the enumeration there much deeper. So now that we have done that, we can also take a look at how to enumerate the other users on the target system. This can be done by typing or listing out the contents of the password file. So if I type in cat etc password, this will list out all the list of users on the target system, and this will include standard user accounts as well as service accounts that are used to handle services like FTP. And Tomcat here, MySQL, which again also in this case reveals that we have a MySQL server here. But in our case, you can see that if we scroll to the top, we have the root user. That's ideally the user that we want to elevate our privileges to. We also have a few others here. Let's try and see. We have the www.data system account here, or service account rather, that's used to manage the web server, as well as the MSF admin user that we're currently logged in as. We aren't able to identify any other user accounts apart from this user here. So again, that might be interesting. So again, it's always good to try and identify other users on the target system that may be configured incorrectly, or may be part of the sudo group, or may have root or admin privileges. Now, to determine whether a user has admin privileges, we can check the groups that this user is a part of. So we can use the groups command and then search and then type in the user here. So if we say tell us the groups that the user is a part of, and we hit enter, we can see that it's only part of the user of the user group. Now if we list out the groups that the root user is a part of, you can see it's part of the root group. And if we list out the groups that the MSF admin user is currently a part of, we can see that is part of a few others that are used to control services like let's see, like audio, video, Samba, and as well as the admin group, which is interesting, right? Now, we can also list out the groups on the system by typing in cat etc group, right? and that will list out all the groups on the system. And we just discovered one interesting one, which of course number one is going to be the root group, but we also discovered the admin group, if we can actually identify it here. Let me just try and run this with grep admin. Let's see if this actually exists. Can we find it here? There we are. So that's the admin group there. All right, so we can actually identify groups like that. Now, of course, we can also, talk about SUID binaries that belong to particular users. But again, we have a chapter that's focused on that primarily. So let's move on to network enumeration on Linux. So again, network enumeration can be performed simply by, first of all, identifying the network interfaces. And that can be done by typing in the ifconfig command. In this case, you can see we have the localhost adapter, or the localhost interface, and we have the Ethernet 0 interface, which is the Ethernet connection. It gives us the IP address of the target, and we can also identify the default gateway here, if I can actually find that information. It's not actually listing that here, so we might actually want to run the IPAS command. And in this case, does that list out the gateway? No, it does not list out the gateway, but we are able to identify the IP address of the target system. So if we want to, analyze the routing table to identify the default gateway, we can type in the route command, and you can see that the default gateway is set to, there we are, that's the IP there. So we know that that is correct, and it also gives us, the destination, so on and so forth. So if you want to analyze the routing table, that is how to do it. Now, another important aspect here is because another important aspect of network enumeration is identifying services that are currently running and their respective ports that they're running on, because typically Linux will be deployed as a server, and a server is going to be running services that can be accessible. So, a server is typically used to host a website, a database, so on and so forth. So we can try and identify the actual ports, the open ports, and the services that are running on these open ports by using the netstart command, and we'll use the ANT option. And again, similar to Windows, this will sort it out into the protocol, the local address, the foreign address, and the state. So currently, these are the connections that are currently listening. And of course, we have the connection at the bottom, which is our SSH connection, which again connects back to our Kali IP. And the connection is established. But from this, we can identify services that are running on the target. So for example, we can see that we have a web server running on port 80 on the target. We also have FTP running on the target. We also have Telnet running on the target. So, just by looking at the port numbers, we can identify the services running. And we're also able to identify that we have Samba or some version of SMB. There we are, port 445. And port 139. So we do have a Samba running as well. So just through listing out the services that are currently running and the ports they're listening on, we can identify what services are being hosted here. Now, as I said, we're not going to be taking a look at automated enumeration scripts because, again, we'll be covering them throughout the rest of this book because they'll become more useful then. So that is going to conclude this particular code in action video, and I'll be seeing you in the next chapter.